Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. This phrase has echoed through the millennia, a truth as constant as the stars themselves. But what if that war had a victor? What if, instead of the eternal stalemate that defines the 41st millennium, one force had grown powerful enough to sweep aside all opposition and claim dominion over the entire galaxy? What if that force was green? Picture, if you will, a galaxy transformed. The golden throne of terror lies in ruins, its last defenders long since crushed beneath the weight of countless green-skinned warriors. The Eye of Terror, that bleeding wound in reality, has been surrounded and contained, its demonic hordes beaten back by sheer, brutal physicality. The silent Necron tombs have been cracked open and their inhabitants scattered. Yet the Tyranid hive fleets have been met in open space and destroyed, their bioships torn apart by millions of ramshackle vessels that shouldn't fly but somehow do. The craft worlds of the Eldari drift as burning wreckage, and the Tau Empire's carefully constructed plans for the greater good lie shattered beneath countless boots. This is not a future that seems possible when you look at the fractured, warring nature of Orc society. The Greenskins spend as much time fighting amongst themselves as they do battling other species. They are crude, violent, and seemingly incapable of the kind of long-term planning and cooperation that galactic conquest would require. And yet, deep within their genetic code, within the very essence of what they are, lies the potential for something far more terrifying than anything the galaxy has yet witnessed. The Orc Codex itself states it plainly, a warning that few take seriously enough. If the Orcs were ever to truly unite under a single banner, if they were to stop fighting amongst themselves long enough to turn their full attention outward, they would be unstoppable, not difficult to defeat, not challenging to contain, unstoppable. This isn't hyperbole or the boasting of Orc players hoping their army gets better rules. This is established law, a fundamental truth about the nature of the greenskin menace. We've seen glimpses of this potential throughout history. The War of the Beast, which occurred in the 32nd millennium, came terrifyingly close to destroying the Imperium entirely. An Orc warlord of unprecedented power and intelligence united vast swathes of the Orc race and launched a coordinated assault on humanity that dwarfed anything seen before or since. Attack moons, planetoids converted into world-killing weapons, appeared over Imperial worlds. The Greenskins spoke High Gothic and engaged in tactical planning. They enslaved human populations and used them as laborers and soldiers. For a brief, terrible period, the galaxy saw what the Orcs could become if they ever reached their full potential. That crisis was narrowly averted, but the possibility remains. In the current era, Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, perhaps the most dangerous Orc alive, has been steadily building towards something similar. He claims to be the prophet of the Orc gods, Gork and Mork, and his influence grows with each passing year. But more and more Orcs flock to his banner, drawn by the promise of the greatest fight the galaxy has ever seen. The green tide rises, and if it continues to swell, it may soon crash over everything in its path. This script explores that possibility. What would happen if the Orcs truly united? How would they achieve such unification? What would the process of conquest look like? And how would the other major powers of the galaxy respond? Most importantly, what would existence be like in a galaxy ruled by the Greenskins? These questions may seem like mere thought experiments, but they reveal fundamental truths about the nature of the Orc species and their place in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. To understand what an Orc-dominated galaxy would look like, we must first understand what Orcs are. Not the surface-level knowledge that they're big, green, and like to fight, but the deeper truth of their biology, their psychology, their very purpose for existing. The Orcs are not a natural species that evolved on some distant world. They were created, engineered, by an ancient and impossibly advanced civilization for a very specific purpose. And that purpose, that core function, encoded into every cell of their hybrid bodies, is the key to understanding why their unification would spell doom for every other intelligent species in the galaxy. The nature of the beast, Ork biology and origins. The Orks are a contradiction wrapped in green skin and wrapped around crude weaponry. They appear primitive, wearing ramshackle armor and wielding guns that look like they were assembled in someone's garage with spare parts and hope. They speak in crude, broken language that seems to indicate limited intelligence. Their society appears anarchic, based entirely on violence and the threat of violence. And yet, beneath this savage exterior lies something far more sophisticated and terrifying than most realize. At the most fundamental level, Orks are a fusion of animal and fungus. This hybrid nature is not some quirk of evolution or a mutation that occurred over time. It is the result of deliberate genetic engineering, a feature carefully crafted by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven, that ancient conflict that shaped the galaxy millions of years before humans ever looked up at the stars. The Old Ones, those mysterious reptilian beings who created the Eldari and other psychic races, needed soldiers to fight the Necrons and their star-eating gods, the Satan. They needed warriors who could breed quickly, survive in the harshest environments, and who would never stop fighting, no matter the odds against them. The result was the Krork, the ancient predecessors of modern Orks. These beings were larger, more intelligent, and more technologically advanced than their current descendants. Some records suggest individual Krork could stand as tall as 12 meters, towering giants of muscle and engineered flesh. They possessed technology that rivaled that of any other species in the galaxy, and they wielded it with brutal efficiency. When the War in Heaven ended and the Old Ones vanished, the Krork remained, but without their masters to guide them, they began to devolve. Over millions of years, they became the Orks we know today, smaller and less sophisticated, now but still carrying within them the potential to reclaim their former glory. This devolution was not complete degradation, however. The Orks retained many of the advantages their creators had engineered into them, and in some ways, the simplified form they now take makes them even more effective as a species. Their fungal nature is the foundation of their incredible resilience. Unlike purely animal-based life forms, Orks have simplified internal anatomy. They lack many of the complex organs that would make them vulnerable to injury. Where a human has an intricate cardiovascular system, delicate digestive organs, and a brain that can be easily damaged, an Ork's body is far more robust and redundant. This fungal aspect grants them regenerative abilities that border on the miraculous. As an Ork that has been hacked apart can often be stitched back together and return to battle, bewildered but functional, they can regrow limbs given time and proper nutrition. Only the most grievous wounds or complete incineration can truly ensure an Ork stays dead. Imperial forces have learned through bitter experience that you must burn Ork bodies and sterilize battlefields with chemical weapons, or within weeks you'll face a new generation of greenskins sprouting from the soil where their predecessors fell. This is because of the Ork reproductive system, which is unlike anything else in the galaxy. Orks do not reproduce sexually. They have no concept of gender, no families, no childhood in any traditional sense. Instead, they reproduce through spores. Every Ork constantly sheds microscopic spores throughout its life, and when it dies, millions more burst forth from its body. These spores can lie dormant for years, even decades, waiting for favorable conditions. When those conditions arrive, they begin the Ork life cycle. First come the squigs, those bizarre, teeth-filled creatures that Orks use for everything from food to ammunition to pets. The squigs feed on the fungal growth and help spread the spores further. Then come the snotlings, diminutive and relatively stupid even by greenskin standards, who tend to the growing ecosystem. After them arrive the Gretchen or grots, who are slightly larger and more intelligent, capable of building simple structures and following basic orders. Finally, from this prepared ecosystem, full-sized orcs begin to emerge. This system means that an orc infestation is almost impossible to fully eradicate. Or even if you kill every orc on a planet, even if you scour their settlements and burn their camps, the spores remain. They hide in cracks in the foundation, in underground caverns, in the hulls of ships. Within a generation, new orcs will emerge, starting the cycle anew. The only way to be absolutely certain a world is free of the greenskin taint is to subject it to exterminatus, to burn or virus bomb the entire planet until nothing organic remains. This is why orc-infested worlds are often simply written off as lost, because the resources required to properly cleanse them exceed their value. But the orc's fungal nature provides more than just resilience and rapid reproduction. It also grants them a degree of photosynthesis. Their green skin contains chlorophyll, allowing them to absorb energy directly from sunlight. This doesn't mean they can survive on sunlight alone, but it does mean their logistics requirements are simpler than other armies. An orc force can survive for extended periods with minimal food supplies, reducing one of the primary constraints that limit military campaigns for other species. While the Imperial Guard needs extensive supply chains to keep its soldiers fed, orcs can simply bask in the sun and eat whatever local squigs they've brought with them. The animal aspect of their hybrid nature is equally important. It provides the orcs with their incredible physical strength and durability. Even a basic orc boy, the foot soldier of greenskin armies, is stronger than most humans. They possess a thick, leathery hide that can turn aside blows that would eviscerate a normal person. Their bone structure is dense and resistant to fractures. Their muscular system is efficient and powerful, allowing them to wield weapons that would be too heavy for a human to lift, and to absorb punishment that would kill most other beings. Orcs also possess a unique growth pattern that is tied directly to their success in combat. The more an orc fights and wins, the larger it grows. This is not a slow, gradual process like human aging. An orc that regularly participates in successful battles will visibly grow in size and strength over the course of months or years. The biggest orcs are invariably the most successful warriors, and this creates a natural hierarchy in their society. The largest orc in any group is almost always its leader, because it has proven through combat that it deserves that position. This growth is influenced by more than just physical triumph, however. It is also tied to the respect and recognition the orc receives from its fellows. An orc that is feared and respected by other orcs will grow larger and more powerful, as if the belief of its peers somehow makes it stronger. This hints at one of the most important and least understood aspects of orc biology, the psychic gestalt field that surrounds every green skin and which grows stronger with their numbers. The Old Ones did not give the orcs access to the warp in the traditional sense. They specifically blocked individual orcs from touching that realm of souls and emotion, presumably to prevent them from being corrupted by chaos. But the Old Ones did give them something else, a collective psychic presence that manifests when orcs gather in large numbers. As this gestalt field is the key to understanding so much of what makes orcs inexplicable and terrifying. Every orc generates a subtle psychic aura. Alone, this aura is barely noticeable. But when orcs gather together, these individual auras combine and amplify each other, creating a field of psychic energy that has tangible effects on reality. The more orcs in one place, the stronger this field becomes. And the stronger the field, the more it begins to warp the world around them to match orc beliefs and expectations. This is where we begin to understand the true horror of what a united orc force would represent. Because if every orc in the galaxy were to gather under one banner, working toward one goal, the psychic gestalt field they would generate would be powerful beyond comprehension. And it would bend reality itself to accommodate orc will, making the impossible possible and turning their crude technology into genuinely effective weapons of war. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand how this gestalt field works under normal circumstances. The gestalt field, when belief becomes reality. The Orks possess what Imperial scholars call a Gestalt psychic field, a collective manifestation of psychic energy that emerges when greenskins gather together. This is not magic, though it might seem like it to the uninitiated. It is a fundamental aspect of how Orks interact with reality, and it explains much of what makes them such an effective and terrifying force. The Gestalt field operates on a simple principle. If enough Orks believe something is true, it becomes true. This is not absolute. An Ork cannot simply believe it can fly and then soar into the air. But if 1,000,000 Orks believe that painting their vehicles red makes them go faster, then red vehicles actually do go faster when Orks are operating them. If Orks believe that a certain boss is the biggest and baddest around, that boss will actually become bigger and tougher. If they believe their ramshackle guns will fire properly, those guns will work, even if their construction makes no sense from an engineering standpoint. This reality warping effect has limits and nuances that are important to understand. The Orks themselves are not consciously aware of their psychic field. They don't sit around thinking, if we believe hard enough, we can make our guns work. They simply know, with absolute certainty, that their guns work. That unshakable conviction, multiplied across thousands or millions of Orks, creates a psychic pressure on reality that forces it to accommodate their expectations. The field also requires a foundation of functionality. Ork technology is not completely non-functional without the Gestalt field. It is crude, yes, and often built with materials that barely qualify as suitable, but there is generally some underlying mechanical basis to it. A shooter is not just a random collection of metal that only fires because Orks believe it will. It has a barrel, a firing mechanism, a magazine. These components might not be manufactured to exacting standards. They might not be properly lubricated or maintained, but they exist. The Gestalt field doesn't create function from nothing. It smooths over the inefficiencies and imperfections that would normally cause the weapon to jam or malfunction. This distinction is important because it tells us something crucial about the limits of Ork psychic power. They cannot simply will things into existence. They cannot make a rock into a gun by believing hard enough. But they can make a gun that shouldn't work into a weapon that functions remarkably well. They can make a vehicle that should fall apart on its first drive across the battlefield into a reliable machine of war. They can make armor that appears to be loosely strapped scrap metal into protection that rivals ceramite plating. The Gestalt field manifests in several observable ways. First and most famously is the color theory that Orks subscribe to. Red vehicles go faster. This is not a metaphor or a cultural preference. When Orks paint their vehicles red, those vehicles actually gain speed. The effect is measurable and reproducible. Yellow makes explosions bigger. Blue is lucky. Green is the best color because it's the color of Orks, and Orks are the best at everything. Black makes things tougher. These beliefs, held collectively by the entire species, become reality through the Gestalt field. Imperial forces have captured Ork equipment and attempted to use it, with mixed results. Sometimes the weapons function perfectly well in human hands, proving that there is genuine mechanical functionality behind them. Other times, particularly with more esoteric or advanced Ork technology, the equipment simply refuses to work properly for non-Orks. Guns jam constantly, force fields flicker and fail. Our vehicles sputter and die. This isn't because the equipment is fundamentally different, it's because the Gestalt field that was sustaining it is no longer present. The mech boys, those Orks with an innate understanding of technology, represent another fascinating aspect of the Gestalt field. These Orks are not educated in engineering. They don't attend universities or read technical manuals. They simply know how to build things. This knowledge is genetic, encoded into them by the old ones millions of years ago. When a young Ork displays the traits of a mech boy, other Orks recognize this and allow them to work on technology. The mech boy itself doesn't question where its knowledge comes from. It just knows that it can take scrap metal and turn it into a functional vehicle. And even if it couldn't explain the principles behind internal combustion or electricity. Different types of odd boys possess different types of genetic knowledge. Pain boys know how to perform surgery and create crude cybernetics. Weird boys channel the Gestalt field's energy into destructive psychic attacks. Runthirds know how to manage Gretchen populations. All of these specializations are inherited, not learned. Another gift from the Old Ones to ensure their warrior race could maintain itself without external support. The Gestalt field also creates a natural hierarchy among orcs through what might be called psychic dominance. When orcs gather, they instinctively recognize who is in charge. This isn't just about physical size, though that's part of it. There's a psychic component where the most dominant orc's presence is felt by others. This is how orc society maintains order, despite having no written laws or formal government. The biggest orc is the boss, because other orcs can feel that it should be the boss. Challenges to authority happen when another orc's psychic presence grows strong enough to contest the current leader. This has profound implications for what would happen if orcs ever truly united. As more orcs gather together, the Gestalt field grows stronger, and this increased psychic pressure affects all the orcs within it. They grow larger, stronger, smarter. An orc that might be of average intelligence when alone becomes cunning when surrounded by thousands of its fellows. A war boss leading millions becomes a tactical genius by human standards, capable of strategy and planning that would seem impossible for a greenskin. We've seen this effect demonstrated during the War of the Beast. The orc warlord, known simply as the Beast, commanded forces that displayed unprecedented levels of organization and technological sophistication. His armies didn't just attack randomly, they coordinated strikes across multiple sectors simultaneously. They built attack moons, enormous weapons platforms that required advanced gravitational manipulation and spatial engineering. They spoke High Gothic and engaged in diplomacy, however brutal. They established an actual empire with infrastructure and logistics. This transformation occurred because the Beast had united so many orcs under his command that the Gestalt field they generated approached what the ancient Krork must have experienced constantly. Yet the psychic pressure was so intense that it actually caused physical changes in the orcs themselves. Standard orc boys grew to the size of knobs. Knobs grew to the size of war bosses. The Beast himself was massive beyond belief, described as being the size of a hab block, towering over even the largest space marines. The weird boys of the Beast's armies demonstrated psychic powers far beyond what is normally seen from greenskins. They could tear apart Imperial Titans with bolts of green energy. They could open gates through space itself, allowing orc forces to teleport across vast distances. They could release waves of psychic force that killed everything in their path. These were not new abilities that suddenly manifested, and they were the natural result of the Gestalt field growing so powerful that it could be directly channeled and weaponized. What stopped the Beast was not military might alone, though the Imperium certainly threw everything it had at the problem. What stopped the Beast was his death. When he was finally killed, along with the other prime orcs who made up his ruling council, the Gestalt field that had been holding his empire together collapsed. The orcs immediately reverted to their usual behavior, fighting amongst themselves over who would be the next boss. The massive, coordinated war machine fractured into thousands of smaller warbands that were individually manageable for the Imperium to contain or destroy. This vulnerability, this tendency to fracture when leadership is killed, is what has kept the orcs from conquering the galaxy thus far. But it's also the key to understanding what would make a truly united orc force different. If the unity were built not just on one leader, but on a genuine shared purpose, if the orcs were convinced that staying together served their interests better than fighting amongst themselves, then the death of individual leaders wouldn't matter. The Gestalt field would be self-sustaining, growing ever stronger as more orcs joined the crusade, and drawing even more orcs to it through the psychic pull of that many greenskins working toward one goal. The galaxy bleeds. Green, the current orc presence. Before we can imagine what a united Orc force would accomplish, we need to understand the current state of the greenskin menace. Yet the Orcs are not a minor threat lurking on the fringes of the galaxy. They are, in terms of sheer numbers, likely the most numerous intelligent species in the Milky Way. Maps of Orc-controlled territory show green markers scattered across virtually every sector of space. There is nowhere in the galaxy that has not been touched by the Orc presence at some point in its history. This ubiquity is a direct result of their spore-based reproduction and the fact that Orcs have been spreading across the galaxy for millions of years. Whenever an Orc warband travels to a new system, it leaves behind spores. Even if the Orcs are defeated, even if every last greenskin is killed, those spores remain. They germinate slowly, producing new generations of Orcs over decades or centuries. These feral Orcs, as they're called, might not remember the technology and culture of their progenitors, but they're still Orcs, and they're still dangerous. The Imperium maintains constant vigilance against Orc incursions, but it's a losing battle. For every Orc world that is cleansed through exterminatus, 2 more are infested. The resources required to properly sterilize a planet make it economically impossible to address every infestation. Most Orc worlds are simply monitored and contained, with Imperial forces striking if the greenskin populations grow too large, or if they begin constructing spacecraft that might allow them to spread further. Currently, the galaxy hosts hundreds of distinct Orc empires of varying sizes. Some are little more than a single planet, dominated by a powerful war boss, and others span multiple systems and have existed for centuries or even millennia. These empires are not formal political entities in the way the Imperium is. They have no bureaucracy, no civil service, no infrastructure beyond what's needed for immediate military purposes. They exist because a sufficiently powerful war boss has managed to beat enough other Orcs into submission that they follow his orders, and because the constant warfare keeps the Orcs too entertained to challenge that authority very often. The largest and most stable Orc empires tend to be those where the Orcs have found a never-ending supply of enemies to fight. The Sharadon Empire, for instance, has persisted for thousands of years because it sits on the border of multiple other powers, providing constant opportunities for raids and warfare. But the Empire of Octarius became a legendary battle zone when the Imperium deliberately diverted a Tyrannid hive fleet into it, hoping the Orcs and Tyranids would destroy each other. Instead, the result was the largest sustained ground war in recent galactic history, with both sides growing stronger from the constant combat. What's terrifying about these stable empires is that they demonstrate what Orcs are capable of when they have sustained conflict to keep them unified. The Orcs of Sharadon have developed their own shipbuilding techniques, their own fleet tactics, their own specialized units and vehicles. They're still Orcs, still crude and violent, but they're effective. They've raided Imperial territory countless times, sacked major worlds, destroyed entire battle fleets. And they're just one of hundreds of similar empires scattered across the galaxy. The true scope of the Orc threat becomes clear when you consider how these forces are currently divided. The Orcs spend more effort fighting each other than fighting any other species. Every Orc empire is at war with its neighbors, whether those neighbors are Orcs or not. Every tribe within an empire is constantly jostling for position. Every mob within a tribe has its own internal hierarchy that must be maintained through regular violence. This constant infighting ensures that the full force of the Orc species is never directed at any single target. But what if it were? Current estimates suggest there are trillions of Orcs in the galaxy. This is a conservative estimate. The actual number could be far higher. For comparison, the Imperium, which spans 1 million worlds, has a total human population measured in quadrillions, but it can only field military forces, numbering in the billions at most. The vast majority of humans are civilians engaged in industrial production or agriculture, and the Imperium's military is spread across countless war zones simultaneously. The Orcs have no such limitations. Every Orc is a warrior by nature. There are no Orc civilians, No orc farmers beyond those who cultivate squigs for food. No orc bureaucrats managing supply chains. When an orc isn't fighting, it's preparing to fight, building weapons, repairing vehicles, or just practicing violence on its fellow greenskins. This means that essentially, the entire orc population is potentially available for military action. If even half of the estimated orc population were to unite under one banner, the resultant force would number in the trillions. For context, the largest military mobilizations in Imperial history have involved billions of soldiers. The Imperium has never had to face an enemy that could field trillions of warriors simultaneously. The sheer logistical nightmare of such a force is almost incomprehensible. Consider the amount of territory such a force would occupy. Even assuming orcs can pack themselves together fairly tightly, trillions of orcs would fill entire continents on countless worlds. The number of vehicles they could field would blacken the skies. Their spacecraft would number in the tens of millions at minimum, quite possibly hundreds of millions. Every battle would involve more combatants than most wars in their entirety. At the scale alone would be unprecedented in galactic history. But numbers alone don't tell the full story. The real terror would come from what the gestalt field of such a massive orc presence would do. With trillions of orcs generating psychic energy in concert, the field would be powerful enough to make almost anything the orcs believed become reality. Their technology would work flawlessly. Their weapons would hit harder. Their armor would be nigh impenetrable. Their leaders would possess intelligence and tactical acumen, rivaling the greatest military minds in Imperial history. They would be, in every meaningful sense, the Krork reborn. The various orc empires across the galaxy represent fragments of this potential. Each one is a glimpse of what orcs can accomplish when they're not spending all their time fighting each other. United, these fragments would become something that no force in the galaxy could stand against. The question is not whether united orcs could conquer the galaxy. The question is how long it would take and what the galaxy would look like when they finished. To understand that, we need to look at how such a unification might occur. What would bring the orcs together? What would convince them that staying united serves their interests better than fighting each other? The answer lies in understanding orc culture, their clan system, and the nature of the leaders who might forge them into a single, unstoppable force.
I have to pause here for a moment because researching this topic genuinely changed how I look at orcs in the lore. I used to think of them as the comic relief faction, right? The funny green guys who talk silly and exist mainly to give other factions something to fight. But the more I dug into their actual capabilities, their history with the War of the Beast, and especially what the Codex explicitly states about united orcs being unstoppable, it's honestly terrifying. Like, we joke about greenskins, but they're probably the single most dangerous faction in the setting. The Tyranids need biomass, Chaos needs corruption, the Necrons can't reproduce, but orcs, they just need to stop fighting each other for 5 minutes, and suddenly every other faction has an extinction level problem. That is wild to me. It makes you wonder if Games Workshop will ever actually pull the trigger on a storyline where, Gaskell succeeds. Or if that would just break the setting entirely. But anyway, let's get back to exploring exactly how that would play out.
6 clans. 1. Purpose. The structure of united orc society. The orcs, despite their apparent anarchy, have a sophisticated cultural system built around the concept of clans. These are not tribes or warbands, which form and dissolve based on the fortunes of individual war bosses. Clans are permanent cultural identities that persist across generations, defining how orcs think about themselves and their place in greenskin society. There are 6 major clans that are found in virtually every orc population across the galaxy, each with its own distinct character, preferences, and approach to warfare. Understanding these clans is crucial to understanding how a united orc force would function, because unification wouldn't mean homogenization. The orcs wouldn't all become identical soldiers, following identical tactics. Instead, they would maintain their clan identities while working towards shared goals, creating a force with unprecedented versatility and specialization. The 6 major clans are the Goths, the Bad Moons, the the evil suns, the blood axes, of the death skulls and the snake bites. Each brings something unique to the table. The Goths are the largest and most traditionally orky of the clans. They are obsessed with close combat and see the melee as the purest form of warfare. Goths favor black and white checkerboard patterns and often wear horned helmets, giving them a vaguely barbarian appearance. They're larger on average than orcs of other clans, and they produce more knobs and war bosses than anyone else. The Goths' cultural values revolve around strength, brutality, and proving oneself in hand-to-hand combat. They look down on other clans as being too obsessed with fancy gear or clever tactics, seeing such things as dishonorable shortcuts. Gazkul Mag Uruk. Thraka himself is a Goth, which tells you everything you need to know about the clan's position in Orc society. Well, when the other clans think proper Orc, they think Goth. In a united Orc force, the Goths would form the main battle line, the shock troops who crash into enemy formations and tear them apart in close combat. Their natural aggression and size make them perfect for breakthrough operations, smashing through defensive positions and creating openings for other forces to exploit. The Bad Moons represent the closest thing Orc society has to an upper class. Their teeth grow faster than other Orcs, and since teeth are Orc currency, this makes them wealthy. Bad Moons use this wealth to acquire the best weapons, the flashiest armor, and the most impressive vehicles. They favor yellow and gold coloring and pride themselves on having more dakka, more firepower than anyone else. Where a Goth might be happy with a simple chopper and slugger, and a Bad Moon will carry the biggest, loudest gun he can afford, and probably several backup weapons as well. This obsession with firepower makes Bad Moons crucial for a united force. They would provide the heavy weapon support, the artillery, the massive guns that can destroy enemy fortifications from kilometers away. Their natural tendency towards showing off means they push the limits of what Orc technology can accomplish, creating ever larger and more destructive weapons. In battle, Bad Moon formations would lay down withering fire support, softening up enemy positions before the Goths charge in to finish the job. The Evil Suns are defined by their love of speed. They believe absolutely in the maxim, red ones go faster, and they paint everything they own in bright red and orange with flame patterns. Evil Suns have more speed freaks than any other clan, Orcs so addicted to velocity that they become physically dependent on the sensation of high-speed movement. The clan produces large numbers of mech boys to keep their vehicles running, and they favor mobile warfare, striking fast and hard before the enemy can respond. In a united Orc force, the Evil Suns would provide rapid response capabilities and flanking operations. Their vehicle-heavy forces could redeploy quickly to threatened sectors or exploit breakthroughs in enemy lines. They would also excel at raiding enemy supply lines and conducting hit-and-run attacks that keep the opposition off balance. The Evil Suns' love of speed would make them the perfect choice for deep strikes and aggressive maneuver warfare. But the Blood Axes are controversial among other Orcs because they've learned to use tactics, strategy, and even occasionally work with non-Orcs if it serves their purposes. They favor camouflage, use actual military organization with ranks and formations, and sometimes employ retreat and ambush tactics that other clans see as cowardly. Blood Axes have the most experience fighting alongside or against the Imperium, and they've picked up techniques from human armies. They're the clan most likely to use things like cover, suppressing fire, and coordinated advances. Other clans don't trust Blood Axes, calling them sneaky gits and Humi lovers, but they can't deny the effectiveness of Blood Axes methods. In a united force, the Blood Axes would handle special operations, reconnaissance, and urban warfare. But their willingness to use unconventional tactics makes them valuable for situations where straight-up combat isn't the best option. They would also be crucial for managing non-Orc populations in conquered territory, since they have experience dealing with other species without immediately killing them. The Death Skulls are looters and scavengers taken to an extreme. They believe blue is lucky, paint themselves accordingly, and steal everything that isn't nailed down. And then they steal the nails too. Death Skulls have a reputation for being petty thieves who will rob their fellow orcs blind, given half a chance. But this tendency toward looting makes them incredibly resourceful. Death Skulls can cobble together functional equipment from literal garbage, and they have an eye for spotting valuable salvage on the battlefield. As in a united force, Death Skulls would handle logistics and equipment recovery in their own unique way. They would salvage and repurpose enemy equipment, ensuring nothing goes to waste. Their natural tendency to loot everything means they would maximize the utility gained from every battle, stripping downed enemy vehicles for parts and recycling equipment from fallen orcs. They would also be excellent at urban combat and fighting in ruins, since they instinctively look for useful items and know how to navigate debris-strewn terrain. The Snakebites are the most primitive of the major clans, rejecting much of modern orc technology in favor of traditional ways. They ride giant squigs into battle instead of driving vehicles, use spears and bows alongside more conventional weapons, and maintain a closer connection to the natural orc lifestyle. Our other clans see them as backward, but Snakebites are incredibly tough and resilient, able to survive in environments that would kill more civilized orcs. In a united force, Snakebites would be perfect for wilderness operations and fighting in harsh environments. Their ability to thrive without technological support makes them ideal for long-range operations far from supply lines. They would also provide cavalry units in the form of squig riders, adding another dimension to the force's tactical options. And despite their primitive nature, Snakebites produce fierce warriors who can hold their own in any fight. Beyond these 6 major clans, there are also freebooters, orcs, who have left or been exiled from their clans and now work as mercenaries and pirates. Freebooters are individualistic by orc standards, focused on personal glory and acquiring loot. They would provide the naval forces for a united orc armada, since they have the most experience with space combat and ship-to-ship warfare. Their ships would form the core of the fleet, supplemented by the cruder but more numerous vessels of the other clans. The beauty of the clan system is that it allows for specialization while maintaining the fundamental unity of purpose that all orcs share, finding good fights and winning them. In a united force, each clan would take on roles that match their cultural values and strengths. The Goths would lead the charge. The Bad Moons would provide heavy firepower. The Evil Sons would handle mobile operations. The Blood Axes would conduct special ops. The Death Skulls would manage logistics and salvage. The Snakebites would fight in hostile environments. But the Freebooters would control space. This natural division of labor means that uniting the clans wouldn't require forcing them to fight in ways they don't want to. Instead, it would mean organizing them so each clan does what it does best. A sufficiently powerful and charismatic war boss could sell this to the clans as common sense, the most efficient way to find the best fights and win the biggest victories. The key would be keeping them all focused on external enemies rather than each other, maintaining the sense that there are always bigger and better fights to be found by working together. History shows us this is possible. The War of the Beast demonstrated that orcs can maintain unity for extended periods if the threat they're facing or the reward they're seeking is compelling enough. The Beast managed to unite not just individual warbands but entire clans and empires under his command. His forces maintained discipline and coordination for years, long enough to bring the Imperium to its knees. What made this possible was not just the Beast's personal power, though that was certainly a factor. It was the fact that the orcs under his command were experiencing the greatest fights of their lives. This is the key insight that explains how a permanent unification might be achieved. The orcs wouldn't need to be forced or tricked into staying together. They would stay together because doing so provides them with access to bigger and better battles than they could ever find alone. A united orc crusade rolling across the galaxy would encounter the most powerful enemies, face the greatest challenges, must win the most glorious victories. Why would any orc want to leave such a force to go back to fighting over scrap heaps on some backwater world? The Gestalt field would reinforce this unity. As the crusade grew, the psychic pressure would make every orc in it feel more alive, more powerful, more capable than they ever had before. The sense of being part of something greater than themselves, something that was going to stomp the entire galaxy flat, would be intoxicating. Orcs who tried to leave would find themselves drawn back, pulled by the psychic attraction of so many greenskins working toward one goal. This doesn't mean there would be no internal conflict. Orcs fight for entertainment and to establish hierarchy. But that violence would be directed inward in controlled ways. Our pit fights and contests to determine who leads individual units, rather than the kind of all-out civil war that typically tears orc forces apart. As long as there were external enemies providing sufficient entertainment and challenge, the internal violence would remain manageable. The warboss who could forge such a force would need to be exceptional. Not just powerful, though that's certainly necessary. Not just cunning, though that helps. They would need vision, the ability to articulate to other orcs why unity serves everyone's interests. They would need the respect of all the clans, which means demonstrating excellence in all forms of warfare. Most importantly, they would need the blessing of the orc gods, Gork and Mork, or at least the ability to convince other orcs they have that blessing. In the current era, but one orc stands above all others as a candidate for this role. Kazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka, the prophet of the Great Crusade, the beast of Armageddon, perhaps the most dangerous greenskin alive. To understand what a united orc galaxy would look like, we need to understand Gazkul and his vision for the future of his species. Lessons from history. The War of the Beast. Before we explore how modern orcs might unite the galaxy, we must look to history. The War of the Beast, which occurred in the 32nd millennium, approximately 1500 years after the Horus Heresy, remains the closest the orcs have ever come to achieving total galactic dominance. It stands as both a warning and a blueprint, showing what happens when the greenskins manage to organize beyond their normal chaotic squabbling. Whilst the Imperium of the 32nd millennium was a very different place from the grim darkness of the 41st. Centuries had passed since the civil war that tore the Emperor's dream apart. The Imperium had rebuilt, consolidated, and enjoyed what could almost be called peace. The traitor legions had been driven into the eye of terror. The major Xenos threats had been contained or destroyed. The Imperium was confident, perhaps too confident, in its dominance of the galaxy. The High Lords of Terror viewed the orcs as a manageable nuisance, raiders to be dealt with by local defense forces, rather than a strategic threat requiring coordinated response. This complacency proved nearly fatal. The orcs had been gathering strength in the Ulanor sector, the same region where Horus had earned his title of War Master by defeating a massive orc empire during the Great Crusade. The Imperium knew there were greenskins there, but assumed they were the usual rabble, disorganized mobs fighting amongst themselves. What they didn't realize was that something had changed. A leader had emerged who was different from any orc warboss before or since. The entity known as the Beast was not a single orc, but rather a collection of prime orcs, each one a massive example of what orcs could become under ideal conditions. These prime orcs were the size of small buildings, towering over even the largest space marines. They commanded legions of orcs who were themselves larger and more intelligent than normal greenskins. But the gestalt field generated by this massive gathering had transformed the orcs into something approaching what the ancient Krork must have been, a genuine civilization with technology, organization, and long-term planning. The first sign that something was wrong came when entire imperial worlds went silent. Investigation forces sent to determine what had happened simply vanished. When the Imperium finally mounted a proper response, sending elements of the Imperial Fists chapter to investigate, they found themselves facing an enemy unlike any orc force they had encountered before. These were not raiders, or even an invasion. This was a coordinated military campaign executed with precision and strategic depth. The orcs under the Beast's command did things that orcs simply weren't supposed to do. They used combined arms tactics. For coordinating ground forces with air and orbital support, they conducted reconnaissance and adjusted their plans based on intelligence gathered. They built fortifications that could withstand siege warfare. They spoke High Gothic fluently and engaged in what could almost be called diplomacy, though of a particularly brutal sort. They even sent an ambassador to Terra to demand the Imperium's surrender, something no Ork had done before or has done since. Most terrifying of all were the attack moons. These were planetoids that had been hollowed out and converted into mobile fortresses and weapons platforms. They traveled through a form of subspace that bypassed normal warp travel, appearing seemingly out of nowhere over target worlds. The largest feature of these attack moons was an enormous face carved into their surface, as a snarling orc visage that could move and speak, conveying the beast's commands across vast distances. The attack moons were equipped with gravity weapons of devastating power. The primary weapon, called a gravitic whip, could tear apart Imperial battleships with single volleys, crushing them with impossible tidal forces. These moons could arrive in a system and literally consume planets, using tractor beams to tear worlds apart and harvest their mass for further construction. They were end-stage weapons, planet killers that made exterminators seem gentle by comparison. The war that followed nearly destroyed the Imperium. Multiple attack moons appeared over key worlds across the galaxy. One materialized directly over Terra itself, hanging in the sky like a grim prophecy of humanity's end. The Imperium threw everything it had at the threat. Multiple Space Marine chapters were virtually annihilated. Battle fleets were shattered. Entire sectors fell to Ork occupation. The Adeptus Astartes suffered their worst casualties since the Horus Heresy. What made the situation even more dire was the Imperium's internal dysfunction. The High Lords of Terra, comfortable in their millennia of bureaucratic power, proved unable to coordinate an effective response. Political infighting and territorial disputes took precedence over addressing the existential threat at their doorstep. It took the assassination of most of the High Lords, an event called the Beheading, before the Imperium could mount a truly unified response. That response came in the form of a massive invasion of Olanor, the Orks' home system. Led by the Primarch Vulcan, who had emerged from self-imposed exile to aid humanity in its darkest hour, Imperial forces attempted to cut the head off the serpent by killing the beast himself. The campaign was brutal beyond measure. The Orks had transformed Ulanor into a fortress world, its surface covered with massive urban complexes designed for warfare. Every street was a kill zone, every building was a bunker. Vulcan finally confronted the primary beast in its throne room, a structure that was half palace and half gargant, a massive walking war machine. The duel between Primarch and Prime Ork was legendary, two beings of impossible power, trading blows that would have killed any lesser creature. Vulcan eventually managed to drive his hammer into the beast's face and detonate the gargant's power source, yet apparently killing both himself and his opponent in the resulting explosion. But victory was not yet achieved. It soon became clear that the beast was not truly dead, or perhaps that there were multiple beasts, and only one had been killed. Another attack moon appeared over Terra, and the Orks' offensive continued. It required a second mission, this one using captured Ork technology to create a devastating psychic attack, to finally bring down the beast's empire. When the Prime Orks were finally all dead, the Ork forces immediately fragmented, returning to their natural state of constant infighting. The War of the Beast taught the Imperium several crucial lessons. First, that Orks were far more dangerous than anyone had realized, capable of sophistication and organization when properly motivated. Second, that early intervention in Ork gathering is crucial, striking at nascent war hosts before they grow large enough to generate a powerful gestalt field. Third, that Ork technology can rival or exceed that of other species when enough greenskins are working together. These lessons led to the creation of the Death Watch, a chapter of Space Marines dedicated specifically to combating Xenos threats. They led to the formation of Ordo Xenos, an inquisitorial branch tasked with monitoring and neutralizing alien dangers before they could grow out of control. The Imperium has spent the 1500 years since the War of the Beast trying to ensure such a crisis never happens again. But here's what the Imperium doesn't fully understand. The War of the Beast wasn't a unique event that required special circumstances to occur, whereas it was simply what happens when Orks are allowed to unite under competent leadership. The Prime Orks were not mutants or some special breed. They were what normal Orks become when the Gestalt field is strong enough. The technology they deployed was not lost archaeotech, but simply what mech boys can build when they have sufficient resources and psychic support. In other words, the War of the Beast could happen again. In fact, it's happening right now, just in slow motion. Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka is building toward exactly the same goal the Beast achieved, a unified Ork crusade powerful enough to conquer the galaxy. He's been doing it for decades, steadily gathering Orks to his banner, building his forces, winning victories that enhance his reputation and draw even more greenskins to his cause. And the only question is whether he'll be allowed to reach critical mass, that point where the Gestalt field becomes self-sustaining and the crusade becomes truly unstoppable. The War of the Beast shows us both the pattern and the potential of Ork unification. The pattern: a visionary leader emerges, begins conquering neighboring Ork tribes, grows larger and more intelligent as the Gestalt field strengthens, attracts more followers through reputation and psychic pull, launches coordinated assaults on major targets, transforms as the army grows into something approaching the ancient Krork. The potential: complete destruction of existing galactic order, transformation of millions of worlds, extinction of other intelligent species who resist. But it also shows us the weakness: kill the leadership and the structure collapses. And this is what has saved the galaxy from Ork dominance thus far. It's also why a truly successful Ork unification would need to be built on something more than just personal loyalty to a single war boss. It would need to be built on a shared vision, a collective goal so compelling that it transcends individual leadership. It would need to give every Ork a reason to stay united beyond the boss says so. Gazgkul understands this in a way the Beast perhaps did not. He doesn't just command through force, though he certainly has plenty of that. He commands through vision. He tells Orks that they are meant to conquer the galaxy, that it's their destiny, their purpose. He claims to speak for Gork and Mork themselves, to be the prophet of a crusade that will dwarf everything that came before. And increasingly, other Orks are listening. Chat the prophet's vision. Gazgkul's destiny. Gazgkul Mag Uruk Thraka is not a typical Ork war boss. This statement might seem strange given that he checks all the traditional boxes. He's massive, standing head and shoulders above even other knobs. He's brutal, having killed countless enemies in personal combat. He's successful, having won victories against some of the Imperium's finest forces. But what sets Gazgkul apart is not his physical prowess or his combat record, it's his vision. The story of Gazgkul's rise to power is itself instructive. He started as a common Ork boy in the armies of a Death Skull's war boss named Dregmek on the planet Urk. During a raid on abandoned space marine facilities, Gazgkul was shot in the head by automated defenses. The bolter round destroyed roughly 30% of his skull and significant portions of his brain. By all rights, he should have died. Instead, he was found by the notorious pain boy Mad Doc Grotznik, who rebuilt Gazgkul's skull using adamantium plates. Something changed during that surgery and recovery. Gazgkul began having visions. He claimed to hear the voices of Gork and Mork, the Ork gods, speaking to him directly. They told him that the Orks were meant for greater things than fighting over scraps. They told him he was chosen to lead a great crusade that would unite all the greenskins and conquer the entire galaxy. They showed him a future where Orks ruled everything, and the greatest battles imaginable raged across the stars forever. Now, whether these visions were genuine divine communication, as psychic impressions from the Gestalt field, or hallucinations caused by brain damage is irrelevant. What matters is that Ghazghkull believed them absolutely, and he was able to make other orcs believe as well. This is what separates him from countless other war bosses who claim to be chosen by the gods. Ghazghkull has the charisma and intelligence to back up his claims with action. He started small, as all orc leaders must, challenging and defeating larger orcs to establish his dominance. But unlike most war bosses, who are satisfied with leading a mob or a war band, Ghazghkull had his eyes on the entire planet. He systematically fought and beat every other major leader on Urk, forcing them to join his growing army. He didn't just win through brute force either. He used tactics, alliances, challenges, everything at his disposal. Or when he couldn't beat someone in a straight fight, he'd weaken them through other means and then strike when they were vulnerable. Within a few years, Ghazghkull controlled all of Urk. He had united the planet's various clans and tribes under his banner, bringing together Goths, Bad Moons, Evil Suns, and all the others. This alone would have been an impressive achievement, but Ghazghkull saw it as just the beginning. He told his followers that Urk was just the first step, that they would take this unity to the stars and show the entire galaxy what orcs could accomplish. Fortunately, or unfortunately depending on your perspective, Urk's sun was dying, expanding into a red giant. Ghazghkull claimed this was a sign from Gork, a message that the time had come to leave Urk and begin the Great Crusade. The arrival of a space hulk in the system provided the means. Ghazghkull led his forces in capturing the massive derelict vessel, and the orcs of Urk left their home world, launching themselves at the wider galaxy. Their first target was Armageddon, a crucial hive world in the Armageddon system. The choice was not random. Ghazghkull somehow knew or intuited that Armageddon held special significance in orc history. It was, in fact, the former planet of Ulanor, secretly relocated by the Adeptus Mechanicus using orc technology after the War of the Beast. Whether Ghazghkull consciously knew this is unclear, but the Gestalt field certainly drew him there, pulled by the psychic resonance of countless orc deaths from centuries past. The Second War for Armageddon, as it came to be known. This was Ghazghkull's announcement to the galaxy that he was a threat to be taken seriously. His forces overwhelmed the planet's defenses with startling speed. They employed tactics and coordination that shocked Imperial commanders. The orcs weren't just attacking randomly. They were conducting combined operations, using strategy and planning that no greenskin force should possess. The Imperium's response was massive. Multiple Space Marine chapters were deployed. The Imperial Guard committed billions of soldiers. The hero of the campaign was Commissar Yarrick, an aging but brilliant tactician who became Ghazghkull's arch-rival and perhaps the only human the war boss truly respects. The war lasted for months and nearly destroyed Armageddon entirely. Ghazghkull was eventually forced to withdraw, but not before inflicting catastrophic casualties on the Imperium and establishing himself as one of the most dangerous orc warlords in history. What most impressed military analysts was not the scale of the invasion, but its sophistication. Ghazghkull didn't just throw orcs at problems until they were solved. He adapted his tactics based on enemy responses. He used feints and diversions. He preserved his forces when necessary, rather than wasting them in futile assaults. He displayed strategic patience, something orcs simply don't do. This wasn't just an orc war boss. This was a military genius who happened to be an orc. 57 years later, Ghazghkull returned to Armageddon for the Third War. This time, his forces were even larger, drawing orcs from across the sector who had heard of his reputation and wanted to join the greatest fight in the galaxy. The war was even more brutal than the first, consuming the planet in industrial-scale warfare that lasted for years. Once again, Ghazghkull was eventually driven off, but only after the Imperium had committed absolutely staggering resources to the defense. What makes Ghazghkull so dangerous is that he treats these defeats as learning experiences. He studies his enemies, figures out what works and what doesn't, and adjusts his approach. He's building something, not just trying to win individual battles. Each campaign is a test, a way to refine his tactics and his forces. He's deliberately fighting against the strongest opponents he can find because that's how orcs grow. The harder the fight, while the bigger and smarter the orcs become. Between and after these campaigns, Ghazghkull has been constantly active across the galaxy. He raids Imperial worlds to gather resources and followers. He fights other orc war bosses and either destroys or recruits them. He systematically works to unite more and more of the greenskin race under his banner. Everywhere he goes, he preaches his vision of a united orc crusade that will conquer everything. And it's working. The number of orcs following Ghazghkull grows every year. His reputation draws greenskins from across the galaxy. Even orcs who have never seen him, who have only heard stories from other orcs, who heard stories from still other orcs, feel the pull of his crusade. The gestalt field generated by his growing forces creates a psychic beacon that draws in more orcs, all which strengthens the field further, which draws in even more. It's a positive feedback loop that shows every sign of continuing until something breaks it. What sets Ghazghkull's crusade apart from typical orc armies is its explicitly stated goal. Most war bosses are content with, let's go find some good fights. Ghazghkull says, let's conquer the galaxy and rule it forever. This gives his followers a sense of purpose beyond just the next battle. They're not just raiding or fighting for fun, though there's plenty of that. They're building towards something, working to achieve a goal that will take decades or centuries, but which promises the greatest rewards imaginable. The closest modern equivalent to Ghazghkull is the Beast, and the comparison is instructive. Like the Beast, Ghazghkull has united multiple clans and tribes. And like the Beast, he displays intelligence and strategic thinking far beyond normal orc levels. Like the Beast, he inspires absolute loyalty in his followers. Like the Beast, he's steadily growing larger and more powerful as his crusade continues. The main difference is that Ghazghkull is being more cautious, more deliberate in his approach. He learned from the Beast's mistakes, the primary one being that you can't take on the entire Imperium at once, even with a massive army. Ghazghkull's strategy appears to be to build his forces to the point where they're truly unstoppable before launching his main offensive. He's gathering orcs, yes, but he's also training them through constant warfare, making them more effective fighters. He's accumulating resources and technology. He's identifying key targets and planning how to take them. When he finally makes his move, when he decides the time is right to launch the great crusade he's been promising, the Imperium may find itself facing an enemy that it simply cannot defeat. The question is, what would that crusade look like? How would a united orc force under Ghazghkull's command actually conquer the galaxy? What stages would the process go through, and how long would it take? To answer these questions, we need to think through the practicalities of orc expansion on a galactic scale. The first 100 years. Initial conquest. Imagine that tomorrow, through some combination of Ghazghkull's charisma, the influence of the Gestalt field, and simple orc pragmatism, every major orc warboss in the galaxy swears loyalty to the prophet of the Great Crusade. The fighting among orcs doesn't stop completely. They're still orcs after all, but it becomes subordinated to the larger goal of conquering every other species. The various clans maintain their identities but work together, each taking on roles that match their strengths. The trillions of orcs across the galaxy turn their attention outward rather than inward. What happens next? The first effect would be psychological. The Imperium, the Eldar, the Tau, every species with the capacity to monitor galactic events, would notice something unprecedented. Orc attacks have suddenly become coordinated. What were once isolated raids by individual war bands have transformed into organized campaigns with multiple forces supporting each other. Orc armies that were formerly fighting each other are now working together. The reports flooding into Imperial command centers would be initially dismissed as errors or exaggerations. Orcs don't cooperate on this scale. It has to be a mistake. But the reports would keep coming. Entire sectors would find themselves under assault by Ork forces displaying unprecedented coordination. And more alarming, these assaults would be effective in ways that Ork attacks usually aren't. Targets would be chosen based on strategic value rather than random opportunity. Defenses would be probed for weaknesses. Forces would be massed at decisive points rather than spread out attacking everything equally. This would force the Imperium to confront a terrifying reality. The Greenskins had learned to wage real war. The Gestalt field would begin growing exponentially. With so many Orks united under one purpose, the psychic pressure would start affecting individual Greenskins almost immediately. They would grow larger, stronger, smarter. War bosses would gain tactical abilities rivaling Imperial commanders. Mech boys would start producing technology that actually makes sense from an engineering perspective. Weird boys would channel unprecedented amounts of power, turning entire battlefields into psychic kill zones. The Orks would be evolving in real time, transforming back into something approaching the Krork. The Imperium's initial response would be hampered by its own institutional limitations. The Adeptus Terra operates on timescales measured in decades. Getting approval for major military mobilizations requires going through bureaucratic channels that can take months or years. The Imperium is simply not built to respond quickly to sudden, galaxy-wide threats. By the time the High Lords of Terra recognized the scale of the problem and authorized appropriate responses, the Orks would have already secured significant gains. Within the first year, the Orks would likely overrun hundreds of worlds. Not necessarily major planets. The defenses of hive worlds and fortress worlds would hold at least initially, but outlying colonies, mining operations, agri-worlds, and other lightly defended territories would fall in droves. Each world conquered would add its resources to the Ork war machine. More importantly, each world conquered would add its population of enslaved humans to the Ork labor force. This is a crucial point that many overlook when considering Ork conquest. The Greenskins are not interested in exterminating humanity or other species, at least not immediately. They want slaves, workers who can be forced to produce equipment, weapons, and supplies. The Orks themselves are warriors, but they're not stupid. They know that having someone else do the boring work means more time for fighting. Enslaved human populations would find themselves pressed into service in Ork workshops and factories, building weapons under the supervision of mech boys, tending to squig farms, maintaining vehicles. The first decade would see the Orks consolidating their gains and preparing for larger operations. Conquered worlds would be transformed into staging grounds and supply depots. Massive shipyards would be constructed, churning out crude but functional spacecraft by the thousands. The Orks would be building the infrastructure necessary to support a crusade of unprecedented scale, and all the while, as the crusade itself would continue expanding, pushing into new sectors and bringing more worlds under green-skinned rule. Imperial forces would win victories during this period. Ork invasions would be turned back. Entire fleets would be destroyed. War bosses would be killed and their forces scattered. But these victories would be local and temporary. For every Ork killed, another 5 would sprout from the spores left behind. For every fleet destroyed, 2 more would be constructed in the rapidly expanding Ork shipyards. The Imperium would be fighting a war of attrition it couldn't possibly win, because the enemy was reproducing faster than they could be killed. The Eldar would face a similar situation. Their craft worlds would be relatively safe initially, protected by superior technology and mobility. But Exodite worlds, Maiden worlds, and other Eldar settlements would come under assault. The Orks would care nothing for the cultural significance of these places. They would smash through the Eldar's carefully maintained ecosystems and replace them with fungal growths that support greenskin life. The Eldar would fight desperately to protect these worlds, and they would win many battles, but the sheer numbers arrayed against them would make ultimate victory impossible. The Tau Empire would be completely overwhelmed. Their relatively small military, stretched thin, maintaining their existing territory, would be incapable of mounting effective resistance against an Ork crusade of this scale. The greater good would mean nothing to greenskins who only understand strength and conquest. Within 20 years, the Tau Empire would effectively cease to exist as an independent polity, its worlds conquered or isolated, its people either enslaved or fleeing as refugees. Other Orc empires that refused to join Gazgkul's crusade would face a choice: join or be destroyed. Many would choose to join after a brief show of resistance, recognizing that fighting against the growing crusade was futile. Those who stubbornly refused would be crushed with the same ruthless efficiency applied to non-Orc races. Gazgkul would have no patience for Orcs who couldn't see the obvious truth that unity served everyone's interests. By the 25th year, the Orcs would control significant portions of the galaxy. Not the majority yet, but enough to make it clear that the trend was unsustainable for everyone else. Refugees from conquered worlds would be flooding into remaining Imperial territory, bringing stories of Orc atrocities and desperate pleas for help. The Imperium would be mobilizing on a scale not seen since the Great Crusade or the Horus Heresy, but even this massive effort would be fighting against exponential growth on the Orc side. This is when the Orcs would begin targeting major worlds, hive worlds, forge worlds, strategic choke points in the warp lanes. These would be attacked not by the usual disorganized Orc mobs, but by coordinated armies numbering in the billions, supported by fleets that could darken the skies. The defenses of these worlds are formidable, but they're designed to repel or delay attacks until relief forces can arrive, against an enemy with effectively unlimited numbers and no concern for casualties. Even the strongest fortresses can eventually be overwhelmed through attrition. The Imperium would begin losing these crucial worlds. Each one lost would be a strategic catastrophe, disrupting supply chains and weakening the overall defensive posture. And as more worlds fell, more resources would flow to the Orcs, making them even stronger. The Gestalt field would grow with every victory, making the Orcs increasingly intelligent and effective. What had started as a tide would become a tsunami, an unstoppable force that consumed everything in its path. By the 50th year, the Imperium would be in full retreat across multiple sectors. The ecclesiarchy would be preaching that these are the end times, that humanity's sins have called down divine judgment in the form of the Greenskin Plague. Space Marine chapters would be taking heavy casualties defending key worlds, with some chapters being completely destroyed. The Adeptus Mechanicus would be producing weapons and equipment at maximum capacity, unable to keep up with demand. The entire Imperial war machine would be straining under the pressure of fighting a galactic war against an enemy that grew stronger with every passing day. Other major threats would complicate the situation. Chaos forces would see the Imperium weakened and launch their own attacks, trying to capitalize on the opportunity. Tyrannid hive fleets would continue their advance, consuming worlds regardless of who currently controlled them. The Necrons would be awakening in greater numbers, adding another enemy to the mix. While the galaxy would be experiencing warfare on a scale that dwarfed anything in its history, a truly apocalyptic conflict that consumed worlds like kindling. But here's the key insight. All of these other threats would also have to face the Orcs. And in a straight fight, force against force, the Orcs would win, not through superior technology or tactics, though their Gestalt-enhanced abilities would be formidable. They would win through numbers and durability. They can throw 1 trillion soldiers at a problem and not care about the casualties, because every death just plants the seeds for more Orcs. They can lose entire fleets and rebuild them within months. They can have their leadership killed, and new leaders will immediately emerge from the ranks. They are, in the most literal sense, an inexhaustible force. By the century mark, yet the galaxy would be unrecognizable. The Imperium would be reduced to a fraction of its former size, holding out in fortified regions but unable to conduct offensive operations. The Eldar would be hiding in their craft worlds, launching desperate raids, but knowing they're facing extinction. The Tau would be gone. Chaos would still be fighting from the Eye of Terror, but even demons can be killed if you hit them hard enough, often enough. The Necrons would be facing Orc forces that rival the ancient Krork in size and capability. a rematch of the war in heaven, but with the odds reversed. And the Orks? They would be having the time of their lives. Every day would bring new battles, new challenges, new enemies to fight. The crusade would have proven everything Ghazghkull promised, the greatest fights in history. A constant warfare on a galactic scale, glory and victory beyond measure. No Ork would want to go back to the old ways of fighting over scrap heaps when they could be part of something this magnificent. This is the trajectory of Ork conquest once it reaches critical mass. Not a sudden, overwhelming victory, but a steady, inexorable advance that compounds over time. Each victory makes the next victory easier. Each world conquered adds to their strength. The gestalt field grows continuously, making the Orks more capable of complex operations. Within a century, barring intervention by something completely unprecedented, the Orks would have effective control of the galaxy. The question then becomes, what happens next? No force can stand. Orks against every faction. To truly understand what an Ork-dominated galaxy would look like, we need to examine how a united greenskin force would fare against each of the major powers in specific detail. The galaxy of Warhammer 40,000 contains multiple factions, each with their own strengths, strategies, and survival mechanisms. How would each of these groups respond to an unstoppable green tide, and what would their ultimate fates be? The Imperium of Man would be the primary target and the longest-lasting resistance. Humanity's great empire spans 1 million worlds and contains quadrillions of people. Even with the Orks united, conquering all of that territory would take significant time, but time is something the Orks have plenty of. The Imperial strategy would likely focus on fighting delaying actions, trading space for time while attempting to identify and eliminate Ork leadership. This is the strategy that has worked in the past, most notably during the War of the Beast. But against a truly unified force, this strategy would fail. The Orks wouldn't just be following a single war boss whose death would cause the entire structure to collapse. They would be following a vision, a shared goal that transcends individual leadership. Killing Ghazghkull would certainly hurt the crusade, might even slow it down temporarily, but it wouldn't stop it. Another leader would emerge immediately, and the crusade would continue. The gestalt field would be too strong, the momentum too great, for a single assassination to derail everything. The Imperium's defensive fortifications, impressive as they are, would eventually succumb to sheer weight of numbers. A fortress world designed to hold against any conceivable assault has limits. It can repel millions of attackers, perhaps even billions if properly supplied and supported. But trillions? No fortification in existence could hold against that. The Orks would simply keep coming, wave after wave, until the defenses were overwhelmed through attrition. And unlike other attackers, the Orks would be perfectly happy to take 90% casualties if the remaining 10% could breach the walls. Space Marine chapters would fight with their usual ferocity, conducting raids and assassinations against Ork leadership. They would score impressive victories, killing war bosses and destroying key installations. But the mathematics would be against them. There are approximately 1 million Space Marines in the galaxy, divided among roughly 1,000 chapters. There are trillions of Orks. Even if every Space Marine killed 1,000 Orks before falling, which is optimistic even by their standards, the impact on the overall Ork population would be negligible. The Astartes would make the Orks pay dearly for their victories, but they couldn't prevent those victories from occurring. The Adeptus Mechanicus would be a particular focus of Ork attention. Forge worlds contain the technology and manufacturing capability that the Imperium depends on. Capturing these intact would dramatically accelerate Ork operations, giving them access to weapons and equipment far superior to their usual crude productions. More importantly, mech boys would be absolutely fascinated by Imperial technology. They would study it, reverse engineer it, and then build their own versions enhanced by the Gestalt field. Imagine Titans built by Orks, equipped with actual proper weapons, but benefiting from the reality warping effects of greenskin belief. The results would be terrifying. The Imperial Navy would face an impossible task. Ork fleets would number in the tens of millions of ships, perhaps hundreds of millions. These would be crude vessels, barely void-worthy by Imperial standards, but they would work well enough for Ork purposes. The Navy could win every void engagement with favorable casualty ratios and still be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. And as Ork shipyards continued churning out new vessels, the numerical advantage would only grow. Eventually, the Navy would be forced to abandon large swaths of space, retreating to defendable core systems, while the Orks spread through the areas left uncontrolled. Chaos would view the Ork crusade with mixed feelings. On one hand, that the weakening of the Imperium would create opportunities for corruption and expansion. On the other hand, the Orks themselves would be a major problem. Unlike humans, Orks are almost completely immune to chaos corruption. They have no doubts, no fears, no ambitions beyond fighting. You cannot tempt an Ork with power when all it wants is a good scrap. You cannot corrupt it with promises of excess when its only pleasure is violence. You cannot infect it with despair when it's incapable of experiencing such emotions. The Chaos Gods would likely focus on indirect methods, trying to manipulate events to bring the Orks and other factions into conflict with each other. But the Orks wouldn't care about these manipulations. They would fight Chaos forces with the same enthusiasm they fight everyone else. Demon armies would find themselves facing green-skin hordes that match them for brutality and exceed them in numbers. The Eye of Terror would become a battleground as the Orks pushed into chaos-controlled territory, seeking the greatest fights possible. The physical manifestations of chaos, the demon princes and greater demons, would fall to Ork attack. Not easily. Such entities are powerful beyond mortal comprehension, but they can be killed, and the Orks would keep fighting until they succeeded. The Gestalt field would provide some protection against chaos powers, the collective belief of trillions of Orks creating a psychic bulwark against corruption. And even if a demon managed to kill millions of Orks, the spores those Orks released would produce a new generation ready to continue the fight. Or the Tyranids would present one of the most interesting matchups. These galaxy-devouring swarms operate on similar principles to the Orks, using overwhelming numbers and bioengineered organisms to consume all life. When Orks and Tyranids clash, as they have on worlds like Octarius, the result is often a stalemate. Both sides are nearly inexhaustible. Both adapt and grow stronger through combat. Both care nothing for casualties. But in this scenario, with the Orks united and at full strength, they would have the advantage. The Tyranid hive fleets are vast, containing trillions of organisms, but they're divided into separate fleets spread across the galaxy. The Orks, unified, could concentrate their forces against individual hive fleets, achieving local numerical superiority. And crucially, the Orks have the Gestalt field. As they fight the Tyranids, they grow smarter and more capable. The Tyranids adapt biologically, but that takes time. The Orks adapt psychically, instantly benefiting all members of the species. The hive fleets would suffer a more fundamental problem. They need biomass to sustain themselves, consuming worlds to fuel their expansion. But Ork-controlled worlds would be incredibly difficult for them to devour. The Orks are a self-sustaining ecosystem with minimal biomass. Kill all the Orks, and the spores will produce more. The Tyranids would expend enormous energy conquering Ork worlds and gain minimal return on that investment. Meanwhile, the Orks would be learning how to fight the Tyranids more effectively with every engagement. The most likely outcome would be the Tyranids avoiding direct confrontation with the main Ork crusade, trying to consume other prey while the Greenskins were busy elsewhere. But eventually, the galaxy would run out of other prey. The hive fleets would have no choice but to fight the Orks for survival. The resulting conflicts would be cataclysmic, world-ending battles that would burn entire sectors. But the Orks would prevail through a combination of numbers, adaptability, and the simple fact that they're having fun, while the Tyranids are just following biological imperatives. The Necrons would be the most dangerous opposition the Orks would face. These ancient machines possess technology that borders on magic, capable of manipulating matter and energy on fundamental levels. They've fought the Orks' ancestors before, during the War in Heaven, and emerged victorious. Their weapons can disintegrate enemies at the atomic level. Their ships can travel through space and time itself. On paper, the Necrons should be able to handle any Ork threat, but the Necrons have critical weaknesses that the Orks exploit perfectly. First, they cannot reproduce. Every Necron warrior destroyed is gone forever, with no way to replace it. The Orks produce more warriors passively through spore reproduction. Second, the Necrons are divided into competing dynasties that often fight amongst themselves. Even if they recognize the Ork threat as existential, getting the various dynasties to cooperate would be nearly impossible. Third, and most importantly, most Necrons are still dormant. There are millions of tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy, but only a fraction have awakened. The Orks could attack and destroy tomb worlds before their inhabitants could fully activate. Yet the Necrons who are awake would fight with cold efficiency, destroying Ork forces with advanced weaponry. But against trillions of enemies, even Necron efficiency has limits. The Orks would overwhelm individual tomb worlds through sheer numbers, accepting catastrophic casualties to eventually breach defenses and destroy the sleepers within. The Necrons would inflict devastating losses on the Orks, but losses don't matter when you reproduce through spores. Every Ork killed in battle against the Necrons would release spores that would produce new Orks within months. The Eldar would face perhaps the most tragic fate. Their once mighty civilization has been reduced to scattered craft worlds, hiding in the webway, desperately trying to survive long enough to birth a new god who might save them. The Eldar are ancient, wise, and possess technology that makes Imperial equipment look primitive. They can see the future through their farseers and plan accordingly. But all the foresight in the galaxy means nothing when every possible future leads to the same outcome. The craft worlds would attempt to flee the Ork advance, using their superior mobility to stay ahead of the crusade. But the Orks would eventually corner them. The webway offers many paths, but not infinite ones. The Eldar would fight defensive battles with their usual grace and skill, each Eldar warrior killing dozens or hundreds of Orks before falling. But the mathematics would be inexorable. There are perhaps a few billion Eldar remaining in the entire galaxy. There are trillions of Orks. The Eldar would lose through attrition if nothing else. Some craft worlds might survive by fleeing the galaxy entirely, abandoning their ancient home to search for safety in the void between galaxies. Others would make last stands in the webway, using their intimate knowledge of its passages to create kill zones that even the Orks couldn't easily breach. But most would fall, their populations slaughtered, their infinity circuits shattered. The Eldar's millennia of careful survival would end in green-skinned brutality. The Tau Empire, as mentioned earlier, would be among the first to fall. Their military doctrine relies on long-range firepower and careful maneuvering, staying out of close combat where possible. This works well against enemies who fight conventionally. It fails utterly against Orks, who are willing to charge through withering fire, accepting horrific casualties. To get into melee range, the Tau's advanced technology would count for little when every planet they hold is being assaulted by billions of Orks willing to climb over the corpses of their fellows to reach the enemy. The remaining minor Xenos species would face extinction or enslavement. The Orks would sweep across their territories, either wiping them out entirely or pressing them into service as slaves. Some species might survive in isolated pockets, hiding from the green tide, but they would be irrelevant to galactic affairs. The galaxy would become increasingly monochromatic, green skin replacing the rainbow of different species that had existed before. What about external threats? The Tyranids have hive fleets still in the intergalactic void, approaching the galaxy. When they arrive, they would find a galaxy controlled by Orks, rather than the mixed buffet they expected. As discussed earlier, this would work to the Orks' advantage. The Orks would meet the Tyranids at the galaxy's edge with military forces specifically adapted to fighting them, having learned from decades of combat against earlier hive fleets. The resulting battles would determine whether the galaxy could support life at all. But the Orks would go into those battles unified, adapted, and ready. The galaxy would be transformed into something unprecedented in its history. A single species, a single culture of constant warfare, dominating from one end to the other. The Orks wouldn't exterminate every other intelligent being. Some would survive as slaves, workers to build and maintain the things Orks didn't want to bother with. But the great civilizations that had defined galactic politics for millennia would be broken, reduced to scattered remnants, hiding in the shadows of green-skinned dominance. This comprehensive victory would not happen overnight. It would take centuries of constant warfare, with millions of battles fought across the breadth of the galaxy. But barring something completely unprecedented, some external intervention that fundamentally changed the nature of the conflict, the outcome would be inevitable. The united Orks would win. Not because they're the strongest, or the smartest, or the most technologically advanced. They would win because they can't be stopped, can't be discouraged, can't be permanently defeated. They are the ultimate expression of unstoppable momentum, a force that will keep coming no matter what you throw at it, us growing stronger with every setback until victory is achieved. The Green Empire, life under Ork rule. What would daily existence look like in a galaxy controlled by the Orks? This is perhaps the most difficult aspect to envision, because Ork culture doesn't lend itself to the kind of stable governance that other empires practice. The Orks are warriors, not administrators. They care about fighting, not managing populations or maintaining infrastructure. Yet they would need to exert some level of control over conquered territories, if only to ensure those territories could support ongoing military operations. The first and most important thing to understand is that there would be no unified Ork government in the traditional sense. The Orks would control the galaxy, but that control would be decentralized, and with individual war bosses managing territories as they saw fit. Gazg-Kul, or whoever led the crusade to victory, would be the ultimate authority, the biggest boss, but local administration would be left to regional war bosses. These war bosses would be expected to maintain their territories, keep the slaves working, and contribute forces to ongoing military operations. Beyond that, they would have significant autonomy. This decentralization would actually make Ork rule more stable than might be expected. There would be no central bureaucracy to collapse if leadership changed. There would be no complex administrative systems to fail if communication was disrupted. Each territory would be largely self-sufficient, managed by local Orks who understood local conditions. The system would be crude, but functional, like much of Ork society. While conquered human populations would face varying fates, depending on where they lived and who ruled them. The Orks would not engage in systematic genocide, not out of mercy, but out of practicality. Dead humans provide no useful labor. Living humans can be forced to work, maintaining equipment, growing food, mining resources. The Orks would see humans as useful tools, no different than vehicles or weapons. Care for them just enough to keep them functional, work them hard, and replace them when they break. The conditions these slaves would endure would be brutal beyond measure. The Orks have no concept of worker safety or humane treatment. Injuries would be common, deaths frequent. Medical care would be non-existent or rudimentary at best, possibly provided by pain boys if they felt like it. Food would be whatever the Orks felt like providing. Probably squigs or fungal growth or whatever local fauna could be caught. Housing would be whatever shelter the slaves could cobble together in whatever spaces the Orks weren't using. Some humans would be pressed into military service, forming auxiliary units for the Ork armies. The Orks have historical precedent for this, having used human auxiliaries during the War of the Beast. These soldiers would be equipped with whatever weapons the Orks could spare, given minimal training, and thrown into combat situations to soak up enemy fire and identify defensive positions. Their life expectancy would be measured in days at best. But for some slaves, even this would be preferable to working in the mines or factories. At least death would come quickly in battle. The most valuable humans would be those with technical skills. Engineers, technicians, Anyone who could maintain complex equipment would be kept relatively safe, and possibly even treated somewhat better than common laborers. Mech boys would recognize that these humans could do work the Orks found tedious, maintaining vehicles and equipment so the mech boys could focus on building new things. These technical slaves would form a crucial part of the Ork war machine, keeping fleets operational and weapons functional. Children born into this system would know nothing else. They would grow up in a world where Orks were simply the natural order, the dominant species who ruled by right of strength. Some would internalize this and become eager collaborators, trying to win favor with their Ork masters. Others would nurse resentment and hatred, joining underground resistance movements that would spring up wherever populations were large enough to hide them. The Orks would respond to resistance with overwhelming violence, crushing uprisings through sheer brutality. But here's a crucial insight. The Orks wouldn't actually care much about what their slaves did, as long as the work got done. Human populations maintaining their own culture, practicing their own religion, speaking their own languages, none of that would concern the Orks. They wouldn't try to assimilate conquered peoples or force them to adopt greenskin culture. They would just demand obedience and production. This odd sort of neglect might actually allow human civilization to persist in degraded form even under Ork occupation. Planets would be transformed to suit Ork needs. Fungal ecosystems would spread across worlds, the spore-based life cycle of the Orkoids replacing native flora and fauna. Cities would be repurposed as fortresses and production centers, their aesthetic qualities destroyed in favor of functional military architecture. Beautiful buildings would be demolished or converted into barracks and workshops. Parks and public spaces would become training grounds for Ork warriors. Everything would be subordinated to the demands of warfare. Some worlds would be designated as breeding grounds, places where Ork populations could grow with minimal interference. These would be planets where the fighting was heaviest, where Orks died in great numbers and thus released massive quantities of spores. The resulting Ork populations would be enormous, and these worlds would serve as recruitment centers, supplying fresh warriors for ongoing campaigns. The surface of such worlds would be completely given over to Ork settlements, vast ramshackle cities housing billions of greenskins. Other worlds would be industrial centers, producing weapons and equipment. The Orks would maximize production by having enslaved populations work around the clock in whatever factories and forges they could establish. Safety regulations would be non-existent. Pollution would be rampant. The Orks would strip mine planets for resources without concern for environmental damage. Within decades, some worlds would be reduced to barren rocks, their resources completely exhausted, at which point they would be abandoned for new targets. Forge worlds captured from the Adeptus Mechanicus would be particular prizes. The Orks would be delighted to get their hands on functioning industrial facilities that could produce actual quality equipment. Mech boys would study Imperial technology with fascination, learning how to replicate it and then improve it through the application of the Gestalt field. The result would be Ork-built weapons that actually worked properly, but which no Imperial engineer could make sense of, combining functional design with physics, defying modifications. Space would become increasingly dangerous for non-Orks. The Orks would fill the void with countless spacecraft, most barely void-worthy, but kept functional by the Gestalt field. Navigation would be a nightmare, with Ork ships traveling seemingly at random, attacking anything they encountered. Trade between remaining non-Ork territories would become nearly impossible, as the carefully maintained shipping lanes that supported galactic commerce would collapse into chaos. The Orks would have no interest in maintaining the warp lanes or ensuring safe travel. They would just point their ships at where they wanted to go, and trust in Gork and Mork to get them there. Sometimes they would. Sometimes entire fleets would disappear into the warp, never to be seen again. The Orks would consider this an acceptable loss, the cost of going to find new fights. Human ships trying to navigate through Ork-controlled space would face constant danger, with every warp jump potentially bringing them into contact with greenskin raiders. Communication across the galaxy would degrade significantly. The Astronomicon, that psychic beacon the Imperium uses to navigate the warp, would likely be destroyed when Terra fell. Without it, warp travel would become much more difficult and dangerous. The Orks wouldn't care. They don't need precision navigation. But for the remaining bastions of other species, this would be devastating. Isolated human worlds would lose contact with each other, each thinking they might be the last survivors of their species. Yet life would go on in these occupied territories. Humans would continue having children, raising families, trying to find meaning in a world reduced to servitude. Cultures would adapt and survive. Resistance movements would form, struggle, fail, and reform with new members. Some populations would find ways to make themselves useful to their Ork masters, carving out niches that provided relative safety. Others would suffer constant abuse, ground down by the brutality of their occupation. The galaxy would settle into a new normal over the decades following conquest. The initial period of intense warfare would give way to a more stable pattern of constant low-level conflict. The Orks would continue fighting amongst themselves even under unified rule, sparring to maintain hierarchy and for entertainment. But these internal conflicts would be managed to prevent them from disrupting the overall structure. The crusade would continue, but its targets would increasingly be maintenance of control rather than new conquest. This period of consolidation might actually allow some rebuilding. The Orks would want their conquered territories to be productive, and that means providing at least minimal infrastructure. Roads would be maintained because the Orks need to move troops and supplies. Odd power grids would be kept functional because factories need electricity. Farms would be protected because everyone needs food, even Orks who can photosynthesize. The galaxy under Ork rule would be brutal and harsh, but it wouldn't be completely non-functional. From a certain perspective, this might not be the worst possible outcome for some populations. The Orks are brutal, but not sadistic. They don't torture for entertainment or inflict suffering for its own sake. They just want people to work and stay out of the way. For populations who had been living under oppressive imperial rule, constantly fighting in wars they didn't understand, serving Ork masters might not be that different from serving human ones. At least the Orks are straightforward about what they want. But this is viewing the situation through a lens of human desperation, searching for any silver lining in an objectively terrible situation. The reality would be that Ork rule represents the death of human civilization in any meaningful sense. Art, culture, science, all the things that make human existence worth living, would be subordinated to the demands of the Ork war machine. Humanity would survive in physical form, but as slaves, rather than masters of their own destiny. What about the Orks themselves? What would their lives be like in this green empire they had created? Paradise through war, the Ork perspective. To understand what the galaxy would truly be like under Ork rule, we need to examine it from the greenskin perspective. Because what seems like a nightmare for humans would be paradise for Orks. This isn't metaphorical or exaggerated. And the Orks would genuinely be living in the best of all possible worlds, having achieved everything they were created to do and everything their culture values. First and foremost, there would be constant fighting. Not the desperate survival battles that defined much of galactic history for other species, but glorious, entertaining warfare on an unprecedented scale. The Orks would be fighting each other in managed conflicts that maintained hierarchy and provided entertainment. They would be fighting remaining pockets of resistance from other species. They would be defending their territory from whatever external threats emerged. Every day would bring new battles, new challenges, new opportunities to prove oneself in combat. For an Ork, this is the entire point of existence. They were genetically engineered by the Old Ones to be warriors. And fighting is not just what they do, but what they are. An Ork that isn't fighting is an Ork that's bored, restless, looking for trouble. In a galaxy completely given over to Ork rule, there would always be fighting available. Any Ork who wanted a scrap could find one within hours at most. This would satisfy the fundamental need that drives greenskin behavior. The social hierarchy would be clear and uncomplicated. The biggest orcs would be in charge because they proved through combat that they deserved to be. There would be no question of legitimacy, no debates about succession, no political maneuvering. Just straightforward application of violence to determine who gives orders and who follows them. This clarity would appeal to the orc mindset, which finds human-style politics confusing and pointless. Or why talk when you can just fight and let Gork and Mork sort out who wins? The orcs would have access to the best equipment and weapons in galactic history. With the resources of millions of worlds at their disposal, mech boys would be able to build whatever they could imagine. And with the Gestalt field at unprecedented strength, those creations would work flawlessly, regardless of how impossible they seemed from an engineering standpoint. We're talking about gargants the size of titans, spacecraft that can ram through enemy fleets, weapons that shouldn't exist but do because enough orcs believe in them. Every clan would be pursuing its particular interests without interference. The Goths would be having the best close combat fights imaginable, crashing into enemy lines and tearing them apart. The Bad Moons would be surrounded by the flashiest guns and the loudest explosions. The Evil Suns would be racing across planets at impossible speeds in their red vehicles. The Blood Axes would be conducting elaborate tactical operations. The Death Skulls would be looting everything not nailed down. The Snakebites would be ranging across wilderness worlds on their squigs. Everyone would be doing exactly what they wanted to do. The Gestalt field would make every orc feel powerful and capable in ways they never had before. Even basic boys would be experiencing psychic enhancement that made them smarter, stronger, more effective than they could possibly be alone. They would feel connected to something greater than themselves, part of a crusade that had accomplished the impossible and conquered the entire galaxy. This sense of accomplishment and belonging would be intoxicating. Food would be plentiful through a combination of squig farming and taking from enslaved populations. The orcs wouldn't starve or struggle to survive. They would have everything they needed to maintain their numbers and keep growing. The spore-based reproduction would ensure that casualties were quickly replaced, maintaining the population at sustainable levels. There would always be more orcs, always fresh warriors ready to join the fighting. From an orc perspective, they would have achieved their manifest destiny. The legends and stories passed down through genetic memory from the ancient Krork would talk about a time when greenskins dominated the galaxy, when they were the most powerful force in creation. Now they would have reclaimed that glory, as proven that orcs really are the best at everything that matters. The inferiority feelings that orcs unconsciously carry, knowing that they're devolved versions of something greater, would be erased. Gazkul, or whoever led the crusade to victory, would be revered as the greatest war boss in history, possibly even deified. The orcs might start viewing him as a living avatar of Gork and Mork, or as having ascended to become a third orc god. Shrines would be built, not out of religious devotion in the traditional sense, but out of respect for the boss who made all of this possible. And the leader themselves would have grown to massive size through the Gestalt field, possibly rivaling or exceeding the beast in physical stature and mental capability. The different clans would maintain friendly rivalries, constantly trying to prove they're better than the others. The Goths would claim they're the best because they fight the hardest. The Bad Moons would claim they're the best because they have the best gear. The Evil Suns would claim they're the best because they're the fastest. These arguments would be settled through contests and challenges rather than serious warfare, providing entertainment while reinforcing the clan structure. Young orcs growing up in this environment would be raised into a culture where constant improvement through combat was the norm. They would see examples all around them of orcs who had grown large through success in battle. They would understand instinctively that proving yourself meant fighting and winning. The culture would be self-reinforcing, with each generation maintaining the same values and behaviors. The orcs would have achieved something that no other species in galactic history could claim: complete victory. Not Pyrrhic victory bought at terrible cost, not temporary dominance that would inevitably collapse. Genuine, total conquest of their entire native galaxy. They would have taken on every major power simultaneously and beaten all of them. This would not make the orcs complacent. because complacency requires the ability to be satisfied, and orcs are never truly satisfied as long as there are enemies to fight. But it would give them confidence bordering on invincibility. The orcs would believe with absolute conviction that they could beat anyone and anything, and with the Gestalt field translating that belief into reality, they would be right. The United Greenskin Crusade would be effectively unstoppable by any force that existed within the galaxy. Only external intervention, something from beyond the galactic boundaries, would pose a genuine threat. Would the orcs eventually turn on each other and tear the Empire apart? Possibly, but probably not for a long time. The key is that the Crusade provides purpose beyond mere survival. As long as there are external enemies to fight, even minor ones, the orcs would stay relatively unified, and the orcs are very good at finding or creating enemies when needed. Small populations of other species hiding in remote regions would be designated as targets for hunting expeditions. Chaos incursions from the warp would be met with immediate military response. Any sign of Tyranid approach would trigger massive mobilization. The orcs would also start looking beyond the Milky Way galaxy. Once they ran out of enemies to fight at home, they would begin launching expeditions to nearby galaxies. The Gestalt field would make this possible, allowing their ships to bridge the vast intergalactic void through means that shouldn't work, but do, because the orcs believe they will. Other galaxies would find themselves facing the same green tide that consumed the Milky Way, and those galaxies would fall just as surely as the first one did. From the perspective of the orcs, this would truly be paradise, a universe of infinite enemies to fight, infinite challenges to overcome, infinite opportunities to prove oneself in combat. They would be living exactly as they were designed to live, fulfilling the purpose the old ones created them for. There would be no existential angst, and no wondering about the meaning of it all. The meaning would be obvious. Fight, win, grow stronger, fight some more. Simple, clear, satisfying. Other species would look at orc-controlled space and see a wasteland, a civilization destroyed, beauty replaced by crude functionalism. The orcs would look at the same territories and see a galaxy finally being used properly, with every resource dedicated to the most important activity possible, making war. The disconnect between these perspectives illustrates something fundamental about the greenskin species. They are not just differently organized than humans or Eldar. They are fundamentally different in their values, psychology, and goals. You cannot reason with them or appeal to shared interests because the orcs' interests are incompatible with those of other species. You cannot deter them with fear because orcs love fighting and don't fear death. You cannot corrupt them with promises of power because they already have everything they want. You cannot defeat them through attrition because they reproduce faster than they can be killed. The orcs are, in the most literal sense, an unstoppable force that will continue until acted upon by something of equal or greater magnitude. In the grim darkness, only green, we've explored what would happen if the orcs united to conquer the galaxy. We've examined their biology, their culture, their history, their advantages against every major faction. We've seen what their empire would look like and why they would consider it paradise. But now we must step back and ask the bigger question. What does this tell us about the Warhammer 40,000 universe and the nature of the threats within it? The orcs represent something that most of the galaxy's inhabitants don't want to acknowledge: the possibility that the universe doesn't care about civilization, art, culture, or any of the things that advanced species value. The orcs are crude, violent, and seemingly primitive, yet they're also perfectly adapted for the galaxy they live in. In a universe where war is constant and peace is a temporary illusion, being engineered for war is not a disadvantage. It's the ultimate advantage. The Imperium tells itself that humanity is the galaxy's rightful ruler, blessed by the Emperor, and destined to spread across the stars. Of the Eldar remember when they were the dominant power and dream of reclaiming that glory. The Tau believe their greater good will unite all species under benevolent rule. The Necrons think their technological superiority makes them the natural heirs to galactic dominance. every species believes they should be in charge for one reason or another. The Orks don't need to believe they should rule. They know they will rule eventually, because they're better at the only thing that truly matters: fighting. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, they're right. If war is the only constant, then the species best at war will inevitably triumph. It's just a matter of time. The scenario we've explored isn't even particularly far-fetched. It doesn't require any external intervention or unprecedented events, and it just requires the Orks to stop fighting each other long enough to direct their full attention outward. This has happened before during the War of the Beast and almost destroyed the Imperium. It's happening again right now in the current timeline as Ghazghkull builds his great crusade. The mechanisms are already in place. The process has already begun. The only question is whether it will reach critical mass before something interrupts it. What would it take to prevent this scenario? The most obvious answer is to kill Ghazghkull and any other war bosses showing similar ambitions before they can unify large enough forces. This is the Imperium's current strategy, deploying Deathwatch teams and conducting targeted assassinations against Ork leadership. It's worked to a degree, preventing any single crusade from growing powerful enough to threaten the galaxy as a whole. But this is a reactive strategy that treats symptoms rather than causes. Even if Ghazghkull died tomorrow, another visionary war boss would eventually emerge. The potential for Ork unification is built into their species. As long as Orks exist, the possibility exists that they'll unite and conquer everything. The only way to truly prevent it would be to exterminate the entire species, and that's impossible given their spore-based reproduction and galactic distribution. Some might argue that the internal nature of Ork society makes permanent unification impossible, that they'll always eventually turn on each other no matter what. And historically, this has been true, but past performance doesn't guarantee future results. But the War of the Beast showed that Orks can maintain unity for extended periods under the right conditions. The Gestalt field creates a feedback loop that reinforces unity as long as the crusade continues to provide good fights. It's entirely possible that a sufficiently large and successful crusade would reach a point where it becomes self-perpetuating. The other major powers in the galaxy have their own limitations that prevent them from stopping a united Ork force. The Imperium is vast, but divided, bureaucratic, and fighting wars on 1,000 fronts simultaneously. The Eldar are too few and too focused on their own survival. The Tau are too small. The Necrons are mostly asleep and divided when awake. Chaos is too chaotic to mount sustained resistance. Where the Tyranids are eating the galaxy from the edges, but haven't reached the core territories yet. None of these powers could stand alone against trillions of united Orks, and they certainly couldn't cooperate effectively enough to mount a united defense. This paints a grim picture, appropriate for the setting. The galaxy is poised on a knife's edge, with multiple existential threats capable of destroying civilization as it currently exists. The Orks are just one of those threats, but they're perhaps the most immediate and the most likely to achieve total dominance if left unchecked. The current status quo of constant warfare and everyone fighting everyone else is actually the best-case scenario because it prevents any one faction from winning completely. In a way, this is the secret tragedy of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. There can be no lasting peace, because peace would allow one of the major threats to grow powerful enough to consume everyone else. The Imperium needs to keep fighting to prevent Ork unification, chaos expansion, Tyranid consumption, or Necron awakening. The Orks need to keep fighting each other to prevent themselves from uniting. The Eldar need to keep all the other factions fighting to prevent anyone from dominating. The balance of terror maintains the status quo, but it does so through constant suffering. From an outside perspective, the smart move would be for all the civilized species to unite against the existential threats like the Orks, Tyranids, and Chaos. But such cooperation is impossible given the deep historical enmities and incompatible goals of the various factions. The Imperium would never meaningfully ally with Chaos for obvious reasons. The Eldar view humanity as primitive upstarts who desecrated the galaxy. The Tau's ideology is incompatible with Imperial doctrine. The Necrons want everyone else gone so they can reclaim the galaxy. Nobody trusts anyone else enough for genuine cooperation. So the war continues, forever and always, exactly as the setting's tagline suggests. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, because war is the only thing preventing one of the terrible powers from achieving victory. It's a depressing thought that peace would lead to the triumph of something worse than the current state of affairs. But that's the nature of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, a place so dark that eternal war is preferable to any possible alternative. But the Orc scenario we've explored represents the culmination of one of those alternatives. What happens when the war ends and one faction wins completely? The answer is that the galaxy doesn't improve, it just changes what flavor of nightmare it's living. Instead of varied horrors fighting amongst themselves, you get a single unified horror controlling everything. The suffering continues, just more organized and efficient. There's a particular poignancy to the fact that the Orcs might be the ones to achieve this victory. They're not evil in the traditional sense. They don't torture for pleasure, or spread corruption, or seek to desecrate all that is good. They're just trying to have a good time fighting, which is what they were created to do. They enslave other species, not out of malice, but out of practical need for labor. They destroy civilizations not because they hate beauty, but because they're indifferent to it. In some ways, they're more innocent than the forces of chaos or the cold calculus of the Necrons. But that innocence makes them no less dangerous, perhaps even more dangerous, because you can't appeal to their better nature. They don't have a better nature. They have one nature: fight and win. Everything else is just details. A galaxy ruled by such beings would be a galaxy that had given up on everything except violence. Art, science, culture, love, all the things that make existence meaningful for most species would be subordinated to the demands of endless warfare. Yet from another perspective, the Orcs would be fulfilling their design purpose. The Old Ones created them to be weapons in a war against the Necrons. That war ended millions of years ago, but the Orcs persisted, fighting new enemies because that's what they do. If they eventually conquered the galaxy, they would have achieved what they were meant to achieve. They would have proven that the Old One's final creation, crude as it became over the millennia, was the most successful. Not the Eldar with their psychic sophistication, not the Jokero with their technological genius. The Orcs, with their simple formula of hit things hard and keep hitting them until they stop moving. There's something almost comedic about this outcome, in a very dark way. The galaxy's most advanced civilizations, brought down by the species everyone dismissed as primitive and stupid. The careful plans of the Imperium, the ancient schemes of the Eldar, the cold calculations of the Necrons, are all rendered irrelevant by overwhelming numbers of greenskins who just want to fight. It's the universe's joke on those who think sophistication and intelligence are what determine survival. Sometimes, brute force and adaptability win. So where does that leave us, having explored this scenario in depth? We understand that the Orcs could unite and conquer the galaxy if circumstances aligned properly. We've seen what the process would look like and what the results would be. We know that current trends actually point toward this scenario becoming reality unless something significant changes. The question is, what can be done about it? For the Imperium and the other threatened species, the answer is grim but clear. They must maintain eternal vigilance against Orc gathering. They must strike at nascent crusades before they reach critical mass. They must accept that the war against the greenskins will never truly end, that it will continue for as long as both species exist. This is not a satisfying answer, but it's the only realistic one given the constraints of the setting. For we, the audience, this scenario serves as a reminder of what makes Warhammer 40,000 compelling. It's a universe with no good options, only terrible ones, and slightly less terrible ones. The Orcs uniting would be catastrophic for most species, but the alternative of constant warfare is pretty terrible too. There's no happy ending waiting to be discovered, no secret solution that fixes everything. There's just the long, grinding horror of existence in the grim darkness of the far future. Well, and that's strangely satisfying in its honesty. The setting doesn't pretend that warfare and conflict can be resolved through superior virtue or hidden wisdom. It acknowledges that sometimes the universe is just hostile, and the best you can do is survive a little longer. The Orks represent one face of that hostility, a force of nature that cannot be reasoned with, or reformed or stopped, only temporarily delayed. They are the green tide that will eventually cover everything unless held back by constant effort. So the next time you look at orc models on the tabletop or read about them in the lore, remember, these aren't just comic relief comic space orcs saying funny things. They're the species most likely to conquer the galaxy if given the opportunity. They're the embodiment of war eternal, or of conflict without end or purpose beyond itself. They're what happens when you engineer the perfect warrior race and then leave it to its own devices for millions of years. They're the punchline to the cosmic joke that is the Warhammer 40,000 universe. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And in that endless war, the species that loves fighting most will eventually triumph. The green tide will rise, and when it does, there may be nothing that can stop it from drowning everything in its path. The galaxy may one day be painted green from one end to the other, and the Orks will finally have the paradise they always wanted, a universe devoted entirely to glorious, never-ending battle. That's the future the Orks are building toward. That's the destiny they believe in with absolute conviction. Yes, and in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where belief can reshape reality, their conviction might be enough to make it come true. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the green menace and the horror they could unleash if ever truly united, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and your support helps make these long-form explorations possible. What faction would you like to see analysed next? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, may the Emperor protect, or at least may the Greenskins be too busy fighting each other to unite.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.